I'm Saranya again, here to introduce our next speaker, Dan Toomey. So Dan is a technical specialist consultant for Mexico, Australia. He's a Microsoft certified Azure developer and as well as Azure MVP. He's a technical specialist in BizTalk Server, and also he is a BizTalk 360 product specialist. He is a frequent speaker at Australian community events, including Brisbane Azure Group, which he currently leads. And he's also presented at BizTalk Saturday events, Xamarin Dev Days, and at Microsoft Ignite in Australia. Once again, I welcome Dan for presenting Hitchhiker's Guide to Hybrid Connectivity. Thank you.
So my name is Dan Toomey. I'm a principal consultant for Mexia. And this is the first time that I'm speaking here at Integrate, so I'd like to start off by thanking Saravana and the BizTalk 360 team for inviting me here to speak. It's a tremendous honor and privilege to be standing up here in front of all of you today. And I have to admit, a little bit intimidating too, looking at the wealth of knowledge and experience that's before me. Some of you, I've been following your blogs for my entire integration career. But that said, I also consider you all my friends as well. And I think one of the great things about the integration community is the spirit of friendship and unity that we have. There's just a phenomenal spirit of collaboration that we have. And we share information, we build each other up. Integration is difficult, and BizTalk Server is difficult. But because we share so much and we try to build each other up, we're a very successful community. And I think the transparency of Jim and his team, and they're willing to collaborate with us, helps build phenomenal products as we give them the feedback that they need. So I'm very, very pleased. We integrate as professionals, but we also integrate really well as people. So you probably guessed from my accent, I'm from the United States originally. Somebody's a fan. Born and raised in New York, but I've spent the last 17 years living and working in Australia. So that means that together with Martin and Cameron, I think I tie for second place for the furthest travel to be here at this event. Wagner has us beat with his 30-hour journey from New Zealand. Speaking of Australia, I would just like to shout out my team back home. So I work for Mexia. We are an enterprise integration consultancy. We're a Microsoft Gold partner in cloud platform and in application integration. And just recently, we were announced as the Microsoft Australian Partner of the Year. So we're all very, very proud about that. Thank you. We have a very dedicated and hardworking team at home. So we're also a BizTalk 360 partner as well. So my talk today is about hybrid connectivity. About 10 years ago, if you wanted to take an external resource or an application hosted either in the cloud or in somebody else's corporate network and connect it in real time to an application or a resource within your corporate network, there weren't that many ways to do that. You probably either had to punch a bunch of holes in your firewall, or you had to set up a VPN so that you could artificially join that resource to your network and it could function. But today, there are a variety of different options that we can do to establish that real-time connectivity. And many of them don't involve making any significant changes to your corporate network. The problem with many choices, of course, is that you really have to understand what all of those options are, what the differences are, and how best to choose the right one for the scenario that you're trying to implement. So my goal today with this presentation is to take you on a little tour through all of those options, and through a scenarios-based approach, give you some guidance on how you might choose the best one for the situation you're trying to address. Now, that title I thought was a bit catchy, but it might be pretentious as well, because as I was preparing for this and started to realize the breadth and the depth of the possibilities and everything involved, it became quite an ambitious challenge to fit this into a 30 or 40-minute talk. So I've had to make some changes, adjustments to the scope. So first off, I want to clarify that this is not a talk about integration patterns. right? So there are whole books written on that, and you could never fit that into one talk anyway. I'm talking specifically about connectivity between the cloud and your on-prem resources, and real-time connectivity, not FTP, not brokered type connectivity through a service bus queue or topic, but actually, direct synchronous request response, or at least the appearance of that. It is a conceptual presentation only. I'm sorry I don't have any demos. It's not that I don't have demos. There's one I would love to be able to show you, but unless I get really nervous and talk really, really fast, I don't think I'm going to be able to have time to fit that in and cover all the material that I want to. And in regards to network level connectivity, I'm certainly going to mention it. It's impossible to do a presentation about hybrid connectivity and not mention all of that. But I'm not going to concentrate very much on those options because, aside from trying to save time, I'm going to ask the question that Tord asked on day one. How many IT professionals are out in the audience today? Okay, so there are a few. But the vast majority of you, I'm going to make the assumption that you fall into more of the architecture or development. So hopefully that's a reasonable assumption. So like me, if you're in that role, you probably don't care a lot about network technology. And if you're me, definitely, you don't know an awful lot about it either. But one thing I do know about network stuff is that if you need to make changes there, they don't tend to happen fast. So as a developer, if I want to get something done very quickly and connect my cloud resources to my on-prem resources, I don't want to really have to get caught up in all of the governance and policies that would dictate those rules. So I will mention them, but I will spend more time on the non-network options. So probably a more accurate title for this talk would have been this one. But it doesn't sound as sexy, does it? Okay. So the agenda, I'll briefly mention the network-based options, then I'll go through in a little bit more detail the non-network-based options, and then at the end, I'll go through about 4 or 5 different scenarios of typical hybrid-type situations, and we can talk about what options are probably the best to use. So with the tooling that's available in Azure today, it's much easier than it used to be to create VNETs and to create that kind of network-level integration. But to do that, you probably really need to understand a few basics about the options. So point-to-site connectivity is really about taking a single machine or a host and connecting it to an existing network. How many of you work from home occasionally? Everyone, right? So in order to do that, you need to get connected to your corporate environment, and you usually do that either via VPN or maybe by Citrix. What you're really doing there is a point-to-site connection. You're joining, at least temporarily, your machine to your corporate network. Site-to-site is about taking an entire network and joining it to another one, whether it be virtual or real. And in theory, all of the machines in one network have visibility to all of the other machines. There may be constraints on that based on network security groups or routing rules, but in theory, that should work. The important thing about those first 2 options is that they both go over the public internet. So even though they're private and they're secure, the infrastructure is the internet. And therefore, by nature of that, the predictability in terms of performance for network latency and bandwidth is less than that of this third option, which is ExpressRoute. So with ExpressRoute, you can think of it as taking a giant network cable and connecting your corporate network to whatever it is that you're trying to connect to. What you're really doing is you're renting bandwidth on a physical line that's being managed by a telco somewhere. So performance in that case is actually very predictable. And depending on how much money you want to spend, you can get extremely high bandwidth and low latency with those connections. Now, if you have a web app or a mobile app that's in an app service plan, and it has to be standard or higher, one of your options for integrating with your corporate network is VNet integration. So if you have an existing VNet And if it has point-to-site enabled on it and a dynamic routing gateway, you can connect your website or mobile app to that network, and it will function as if it's sitting in your corporate network. So you can access those resources that way. The thing to be aware with that, of course, is what you're doing is through that website, you're actually opening up a hole into your network. So security is definitely something you need to have in mind and how you're going to manage that. So another alternative, which perhaps might be better, is to look at API management. So if you have API management sitting in a virtual network that has access to your corporate network through a gateway, you not only get an extra layer of security, but you also get all the other goodness that comes with API management. For example, caching and policies, protocol translation like SOAP to REST, and analytics as well. And in this example, there's even one extra layer of security is that you can put application gateway in front of that API management, and then you can use Windows application firewall. So that's definitely one way to address the security options. That's about all I was really going to say about network connectivity. I'd like now to get into the other options which don't require the collaboration with your IT professionals. Not that I have anything against IT professionals, by the way. So to do that, we really need to understand the concept of relay, because relay underpins, it's the technology that's underneath all of the other options that we're going to discuss. Now, Dan did a fantastic job of explaining all of that on day one in his presentation, so I'll go through this very quickly. Traffic out, getting messages out of your network, is usually not a problem. Most corporate networks allow internet connectivity. If they don't, it's a pretty good clue that they're not interested in hybrid connectivity, right? But getting messages into your network, that's a bit of a challenge, because those messages have to traverse a number of boundaries, including routers, NATs, and firewalls, and usually multiple levels of those. So you can, of course, collaborate with your IT professionals and make exceptions for that, but to a certain extent, that feels like you're defeating the purpose of that protection, and it also is a maintenance overhead. So the relay solves that problem in a very clever way. What you do is you host a service on-prem, and you establish an outbound connectivity to a listening endpoint that's sitting in the cloud. And then your client, provided that they can see that endpoint and authenticate to it, they also establish a connection to it. So what you have is two outbound connections that have a rendezvous point in the cloud. And through that, they're able to send messages and relay it back into your organization. And because it's bidirectional, you can send messages and go the other way as well. So that's relay technology. And not surprisingly, the first product I'm going to talk about is called Azure Relay. So this is a relatively new offering in Azure. It's been there for a couple of months, but it's not real. The services that make it up have actually been around for quite a while. So Azure Relay is one of the three big offerings that you get with Service Bus, the other two being Event Hubs and then the queues and topics. And the two services that comprise it are WCF Relay, which is really just Service Bus Relay, which has been around since Azure started, and a new version of the Hybrid Connections. So some of you, or many of you, would probably be aware of the Hybrid Connections. That was a preview offering as part of BizTalk Services. So you're probably also, hopefully, aware that BizTalk Services is now being officially retired, and you actually can't create that anymore. But what they did is they moved Hybrid Connections over the Service Bus and improved it quite a bit. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but we'll start with the WCF Relay. So as you can guess by the name, the WCF Relay relies on the WCF framework. So you need to start by creating a WCF service. It can be as simple as complex as you want, but it needs to implement one of these relay bindings. And with that binding and with your namespace that's established in Service Bus in Azure, you can create that listener in the cloud through that service. And then your clients can connect to that. So the security model for that, by default, is shared access signatures. Although originally, when Service Bus started, it was access control services. That was a bit cumbersome to use. I think they still support access control services, but by default, I think it's shared access signatures now, but I think BizTalk still supports an ACS connection to Service Bus. The great thing about having an endpoint like this, though, is that it can be reusable from many different locations. So certainly from a client that's residing in another corporate network, but also you can consume that endpoint from any other service that exists in the cloud, including Azure or other clouds like your SaaS providers. And if you want to extend your reach on premises a little better, you can actually establish this WCF relay through BizTalk server instead of a standalone WCF service. And in the next session, Wagner's going to talk through that in detail with you. So I'll leave it to him to explain all the magic about that. So some of the constraints with WCF Relay, well, because it relies on WCF, it necessarily relies on the .NET framework, and of course, on Windows then. And it's important to realize, too, that WCF is really optimized for XML messaging. That doesn't mean you can't do other kinds of messaging with it. It's just that it's optimized for XML, so there may be some challenges with that. And I think Wagner's going to talk about that as well in the next session. The pricing is a really good story, though. This is by far the cheapest hybrid connectivity option that you have. So in this scenario, if you leave a relay running 24/7 for an entire month, and you send 1 million messages through that in a month, that would be your bill. Now, that doesn't take into account any data egress charges that there may be associated with that. And the messages, we're talking about 64 kilobyte or smaller. But still, I mean, that cost is inconsequential. So that's really a great story. Hybrid connections is a bit different. That operates on a much lower level than the WCF relay. So this actually operates at the transport level. And as such, it relies on port forwarding, which is over WebSockets, and therefore has no dependency at all on any application framework, WCF or whatever. It doesn't even matter what you're coding in. It literally is just creating that socket connection between your source and your target. Therefore, it's truly cross-platform. So you can run this on Windows, you can run it on Linux. And if you go to GitHub, there's a sample repository of a bunch of examples there, and some of them involve using Apache, trying to remember the name of the product. It's escaped my head at the moment. But there are examples there of doing this with Linux as well. And if you have ever used the previous hybrid connections and used it with web apps or mobile apps, you remember that it was a codeless service to use. That still is there. That will still function exactly the same way. But this new version also has an API accessible that allows you to use it in a whole bunch of other situations as well, if you're willing to write just a little bit of code. So let's look at that first option where you're connecting a mobile app or a web app to a back-end resource. So the way this would work is you establish your hybrid connection in Azure, and once you've created that, and it's defined by the host name, the target host name that you're connecting to, and the port number, you can then download a listener agent and install that on any machine in your premises, as long as that machine has connectivity to the back-end system. So you define it, as I said, by host name and port, connected to your back-end systems. And then when you you add that hybrid connection to your web app, that web app will run as if it was running in your corporate network. This is truly a lift and shift scenario. So if your web app worked when it was hosted on premises, then when you deploy it into Azure and hook it up with a hybrid connection, you won't even have to change connection string. It will just work like magic. There's also the ability to accommodate high availability. So hybrid connections, they're hosted in Service Bus, so we know that is extremely scalable. If you remember the numbers that Dan was showing us on the slide on Monday, some of those numbers have more digits in it than I have fingers in my hand, so I can't count that high, and I won't even try to quote them. But we know that part of it is scalable, but what about your back end? If you're worried about resilience there, so first of all, the host that you're connecting to would want to be a clustered host. When you do that, when you establish your hybrid connection, instead of a machine name, you actually use the cluster name to define that. And then with the connection manager itself, you can install that on multiple machines in your environment and connect that to your hybrid connection, and it will automatically load balance across those. So I believe it works in a round-robin approach. So you have full scalability with that. And the hybrid connection manager, by the way, can manage multiple hybrid connections. So if you define different ones, for different host names and ports to connect to different systems, they can all go through the one, or in this case, the 3 hybrid connection managers. Let's look at the other scenario where you're not using a web app or a mobile app. So previously, it was impossible to use a hybrid connection for this. But now, with the API exposed, all you need to do is deploy a little bit of code on your client server and on the server agent, which is going to serve as the recipient of that, the manager of that connection on premises. And then you have full connectivity into your environment. And that link there is to the GitHub repository that has all the samples in it to create that. This is called the Portbridge example. I'm assuming that these slides will be posted somewhere, so you'll be able to get those links later. So constraints with hybrid connections? Well, to be honest with you, I don't think there are many. There's a few numbers here and limits, but honestly, if you need to connect more than 25 listeners to any given hybrid connection, then you have to start to question whether this is truly a request-response model. I tend to think that this is belonging more to a different architecture. One thing you do want to be aware of, though, at hybrid connections is the amount of data that you're pumping through it. Because with the pricing model, you pay $10 a month for each active listener. And remember, a listener is an agent that's connected to a hybrid connection. With that first listener, you get 5 gigabyte of free data. But after that, you pay $1 for each gigabyte. That may not sound like a lot, but if you're pumping terabytes of information through each month, then this is obviously going to add up very quickly, and it's probably not the most economical model for you to use. So in trying to decide whether to use a WCF relay or a hybrid connection, it's important to understand what level that they operate on. So remember that hybrid connections works down at the transport layer. So that gives you flexibility in terms of the operating system that you're using and freedom from any kind of particular application framework. But as far as anything else, it's pretty dumb, right? It's really just packet forwarding. So if you want to leverage application level functionality like what you get into WCF, the WCF Relay gives you that opportunity. So if you want to do, for example, reliable messaging or message level security, or use any of those features that are part of the WCF stack, then maybe WCF Relay is what you should be looking at. The other thing, too, about the WCF Relay is the scope of what you can connect to is more flexible than it is with hybrid connections. Hybrid connections gives you access to a particular machine or a particular host on a specific port. Anything that can talk on that port will therefore be able to use that hybrid connection. Whereas in WCF Relay, you can make the focus as narrow or as broad as you want, depending on how you program that service. So, for example, you can pinpoint it to a very specific service or application, or you can make it a WCF routing service and basically open up a whole bunch of APIs in your corporate network. So those are the things you need to think about when you're choosing between those two. The last option I'm going to talk about is the on-premises data gateway. So this is really the hybrid connection for your PaaS services. So if you're using Logic Apps, Power Apps, Flow, or Power BI, then you already have access to a number of managed connectors. I think the staggering number was about over 160 at this point. And if you're talking to a back-end system, if your back-end system is lucky enough to fall into this list here, then there's a managed connector that supports the on-prem data gateway. And what this is just an add-on feature that allows you to pump your data down into your corporate network using that connector. So this is an example of a BizTalk connector, and you can see in the configuration for that you have the option to choose to use an on-premise data gateway. and you just supply all the credentials that you need to connect to that server, and it will automatically handle that connection for you. So it works pretty much like a hybrid connection does in that you create your on-premise data gateway in the cloud, and then with that you can download an installer to create an agent on premises that will set up that connection for you, that relay connection. So constraints with this, so it does require Windows to install it on. It can't be, your host can't be a domain controller, and there's restrictions on the kind of account that you can use to set it up. It needs to be an Azure School or a work account. Also, at this point in time, there is no high availability for this. So you can only install one on-premises gateway manager for an on-premises data gateway at this time. The pricing is also a pretty good story with this. You will pay nothing extra to use the on-prem data gateway. Now, it's important to realize that this is just an add-on feature, a capability. Unlike the hybrid connection or WCF Relay, you can't program directly against an on-prem data gateway. It's just a feature, a capability that's added to a connector. So you therefore need to be using these connectors and the services that would host those connectors. So as an example, I've just provided a logic app scenario here. And if that $500 sounds very high, it's because in this scenario, I've assumed that you're going to execute 1 million actions over the course of a month. Now, to put that in perspective, what you need to do to achieve that is you would have to have a logic app that was running every minute, and every minute actually being triggered by data, in other words, not being skipped. And that logic app would have to contain at least 23 shapes in it, all of which would be triggered to action during that time. So that's an awful lot, right? It's not inconceivable, but that's a lot. So, but none of that $500 is incorporated in the on-premise data gateway. That doesn't cost you anything extra. So now I'd like to spend the rest of my time up here talking through a few different scenarios, hybrid connection scenarios, and we can discuss which of these options you would want to use to get the most out of it. So the first one is probably the most common and the most simple. So you've got a web application that's being hosted in Azure, and you need to talk to an on-premises SQL Server database. It's a very familiar scenario. How many of you think that a WCF Relay would be the best thing to use in this case? Show of hands. Okay, a few people, all right. How many think that a hybrid connection would be the best thing to do? A few more people, good. How many think an on-premise data gateway would be a good solution? Okay, one. So basically, I guess all three of those options could be made to work, but the first thing I would be looking at is a hybrid connection, because that is by far the simplest one to configure. It is a completely codeless solution. It's easy to install. It will manage your connection to SQL Server. It will, in most cases, not even require you to change any of the configuration in your web app. And if you needed to connect to multiple systems, like say you need to connect to a database and then another application server, you can create another hybrid connection. You can have multiple ones associated with a web app. So why would you use any of the other alternatives? Well, remember we talked before about the difference between hybrid connection and WCF Relay and the features that are offered. For example, with the WCF Relay, if you wanted to take advantage of some of items in the WCF stack, you might choose to use that. Also, if you're going to be sending through heaps and heaps of data, then from a cost perspective, you might want to consider WCF Relay or even potentially VNET integration. And if you want to use Active Directory authentication, I'm afraid VNET is the only real option for you, because Active Directory authentication isn't supported on any of the other options. I suppose you could use a logic app and an on-prem data gateway, but you're really having to create another moving part that wouldn't be necessary normally. So the second scenario is a virtual machine. So this is an IaaS situation. You could be a BizTalk server or any other kind of application server that you have running that's hosted in the cloud. And you need to connect to some on-premises resources. So how many people think that a hybrid connection would be a good answer for this? Wow, no one. Well, you know, a few months ago, that was probably true. It wasn't an option. But now that we're given an API that exposes the code to do that, you actually can use a hybrid connection in this case. You simply have to deploy a little bit of code. You use the port bridge solution, deploy the client on the server in the cloud, and the server part of it on the server on-prem, and you can establish that WebSocket connection, which will enable you to send messages back and forth. And had I had time, this would have been the demo that I would have shown you today. It's really quite remarkable and how easy it is to get set up. I did actually write a blog post about this, so if you want to read that, just go to the Mexia website, mexia.com.au, and blog, and you'll find a post there on the new hybrid connections. So there actually are many ways that you can do this. So you certainly could use a WCF Relay. You could also use a logic app and a non-prem data gateway. A reason for doing that is that that's probably the only solution here that comes close to being codeless. Because if you set up a logic app and the back-end system that you're connecting to is supported by a connector that supports the on-prem data gateway, then you could basically wire that up with very little code. But again, if you're going to use Active Directory authentication or move heaps of data, you probably want to look at a VNET option for that. The third scenario is connecting a SaaS service to an on-prem system. And the answer to this one, it should be screaming out to all of you. After you've watched a day and a half of John and Kevin and Jeff's presentations, I think everyone should realize that the answer to this solution is definitely a logic app with an on-prem data connector. Provided that the back-end system is supported by one of those connectors that supports an on-prem data gateway, this is really a no-brainer. This is what logic apps were made for, and those connectors that you have make it so easy. With 160 plus connectors, you'd be hard-pressed to find a SaaS system that you don't have a connector for today that you could leverage. But if that back-end system isn't supported, then you would have to find another solution. WCF Relay is certainly an option, but you might also look at API Gateway in this sense with a VNET as well. And then, as we mentioned before, there's a lot of other options and features that you can leverage from API Management Gateway. The fourth scenario is business to business. So this is when your client and the target neither of them are actually resident in the cloud, but it is a hybrid connectivity issue because the solution actually lies in the cloud. And for this, again, I would probably be looking first to see if you could utilize the on-prem data gateway to connect to your back-end system. And if that's possible, then definitely this would be the solution I would be looking at. And if you also leverage the integration account, you have the ability here to validate the schemas and maybe do some transformation before that message even reaches your corporate network. And if you're doing EDI, you also have support with the Enterprise Integration Pack for that. So you can manage the protocols, the AS2, EDIFACT, and X12, and your partner profiles and agreements can all be managed for you in the cloud. Whoops, sorry. You'll trigger happy there. So the alternatives for this, again, if you can't make that work with the on-premise data gateway, then probably a good option would be looking at API Management Gateway. Or you could look at WCF Relay as well. So sort of giving it away, but the last scenario I'm going to talk about is a service fabric cluster. So this is the case where you have a microservices-based architecture hosted in the cloud and needs to connect to an on-prem resource. So what is Service Fabric really but just a bunch of VMs that are linked together as a cluster? So all of the options that are available for an IaaS situation should potentially work with Service Fabric. So again, the first thing that I would be looking at is probably a hybrid connection. You can tell I like hybrid connections. Now, in principle, I would imagine that you could create a stateful microservice that would be able to host the connective capability to the hybrid connection. I haven't tested this myself, so this is theoretical. With Service Fabric, one of the really cool things about it is that if you have a primary replica and that node goes down, then one of the secondaries instantly becomes active, and they're kept synchronized for you all the time. So I'm thinking that either a minor hiccup in connectivity might occur, but they should be able to restore that connection if another node comes online. But I haven't tested it myself, so please don't go and implement this in production without testing it and say, well, Dan Toomey said that you could do this, and I'm not going to take any support calls at 2 a.m. for that. So again, the other options and the alternatives for this look pretty much the same as for an IaaS situation, scenario number 2. So I've included this slide for you. I'm not going to talk through it in detail now, but mostly as a reference for you. I've taken each of the 4 technologies that we discussed and kind of listed their strengths. The way to read this slide is to say, use this technology, this being one of the 4, when you have these characteristics that you need to support. So you can go through that list and look through it and decide whether or not this suits your situation or not. Sorry, I didn't finish that slide. So I've included, I should have taken that out. I've included some references here for you, so I'm pretty sure that this slide deck will be shared at some point. And that first one there is the blog post that I was talking about, where I actually talked through the demo of using the port bridge solution to connect a VM in an Azure to a VM hosted locally. There's a few other great references as well there, including a link to all the samples on GitHub. And there's a lot of samples there, both for the WCF Relay and the hybrid connections. So I really advise you to check that out. And if you're really interested in hybrid connections, which is obviously my favorite technology, I understand there's a really good Pluralsight course out there that you can take to learn more about this feature, written by somebody who obviously really likes hybrid connections. The only caveat with this course is it was written for the classic version, so you'll need to completely ignore the module that talks about implementing BizTalk services, because you can't do that anymore. But really, about 80% of this course still applies to using hybrid connections with web apps and mobile apps. I didn't talk about the API because it wasn't available at the time, so maybe someday I'll get around to updating that course. I'm not leaving until tomorrow, so if I don't think there's, no, I'm just over time actually, so there's no time for questions, but if you want to talk to me, by all means, I'll be around, and you can always ping me on Twitter, and I look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much.